Early in the 19th century, while the rapidly growing United States expanded into the lower South, white settlers faced what they considered an obstacle: Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act, part of an American government policy known as Indian removal, was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 26, 1830. The Removal Act was strongly supported in the South, where states were eager to gain access to lands inhabited by the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Musconetr Creek, Chickasaw, and the Seminole. These Indian nations, in the view of the settlers and many other white Americans, were standing in the way of progress. Eager for land to raise cotton, the settlers pressured the federal government to acquire the Indian Territory. Georgia, in particular, was the major source of the dispute. It was the largest state at the time and was involved in a jurisdictional dispute with the Cherokee Nation. President Jackson hoped the removal of Native Americans would resolve the crisis in Georgia. The Indian Removal Act was also very controversial. While Native American removal was in theory supposed to be voluntary, in reality, great pressure was put on Native American leaders to sign removal treaties. Most observers, whether they were in favor of the Indian removal policy or not, realized that the passage of the act meant the inevitable removal of most Indians from the states. From 1814 to 1824, Jackson was instrumental in negotiating 9 out of 11 treaties which deprived the southeastern tribes of their eastern lands in exchange for lands in the west. As a result of the treaties, the United States gained control over 3/4 of Alabama and Florida, as well as parts of Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Kentucky, and North Carolina. This was a period of voluntary Indian migration, and only a small number of Creeks, Cherokee, and Choctaws actually moved to the new land. In 1823, the Supreme Court handed down a decision which stated that Indians could occupy lands within the United States, but could not hold title to those lands. This was because of their right of occupancy was subordinate to the United States' right of discovery. Some Native American leaders who had previously resisted removal now began to reconsider their positions, especially after Andrew Jackson's landslide re-election in 1832. Although the 5 Indian nations had made earlier attempts at resistance, many of their strategies were nonviolent. One method was to adopt Anglo-American practices such as large-scale farming, Western education, and slaveholding. This earned the nations the designation of the 5 civilized tribes. They adopted this policy of assimilation in an attempt to coexist with settlers and ward off hostility, but it only made whites jealous and resentful. In 1829, President Andrew Jackson called for an Indian Removal Act in his State of the Union message. Most European Americans favored the Indian Removal Act, though there were significant opposition. Many Christian missionaries, most notably missionary organizer Jeremiah Evarts, protested against the passage of the act. In Congress, New Jersey Senator Theodore Flugenheisen and Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee spoke out against the legislation. However, the Removal Act was passed after a bitter debate in Congress. Their protests did not save the southeastern nations from removal, however. The Choctaws were the first to sign a removal treaty, which they did in September of 1830. Some chose to stay in Mississippi under terms of the Removal Act, but soon most of the remaining Choctaws, wary of mistreatment, sold their land and moved west. For the next 28 years, the United States government struggled to force relocation of the southeastern nations. A small group of Seminoles was coerced into signing a removal treaty in 1883, but the majority of the tribe declared the treaty illegitimate and refused to leave. The resulting struggle was the Second Seminole War, which lasted from 1835 to 1842. As in the First War, fugitive slaves fought beside the Seminoles who had taken them in. Thousands of lives were lost in the war, which cost the Jackson administration approximately $40 to $60 million, 10 times the amount it had allocated for Indian removal. In the end, most of the Seminoles moved to the new territory. The few who remained had defended themselves in the Third Seminole War from 1855 to 1858, when the U.S. military attempted to drive them out. Finally, the United States paid the remaining Seminoles to move west. The Creeks also refused to immigrate. They signed a treaty in March of 1832, which opened a large portion of their Alabama land to white settlement, but guaranteed them protected ownership of the remaining portion. The government did not protect them from spectators, however, who quickly cheated them out of their lands. By 1835, the Creeks began stealing livestock and crops from white settlers as a form of retaliation. In 1836, the Secretary of War ordered the removal of the Creeks as a military necessity. By 1837, approximately 15,000 Creeks had migrated west. They had never signed a removal treaty. The Chickasaws had seen removal as inevitable and had not resisted. They signed a treaty in 1832 which stated that the federal government would provide them with suitable western land and would protect them until they moved. However, the War Department backed down on their promise, and the Chickasaws were forced to pay the Choctaws for the right to live on part of their western allotment. They migrated there in the winter of 1837 to 1838. The Cherokee were tricked with an illegitimate treaty. In 1833, a small fraction agreed to sign a removal agreement, the Treaty of New Echota. The leaders of the groups were not recognized by the leaders of the Cherokee Nation, and over 15,000 Cherokees, led by Chief John Ross, signed a petition in protest. The Cherokee were given 2 years to migrate voluntarily. By 1838, only 2,000 had migrated. 16,000 remained on their land. The U.S. government sent in 7,000 troops who forced the Cherokees into stockades at Bayonet Point. It was then that the march known as the Trail of Tears began. The Trail of Tears was a forced relocation and movement of Native Americans from their homelands to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, in the western United States. Many Native Americans suffered from exposure, disease, and starvation while en route to their destinations, and many died, including 4,000 of the 15,000 relocated Cherokee. By 1837, the Jackson administration had removed 46,000 Native American people from their land east of the Mississippi and had secured treaties which led to the removal of a slightly larger number. Most members of the 5 southeastern nations had been relocated west, opening 25 million acres of land to white settlement and to slavery.